All right, let's talk about the Republican Party or the Grand Old Party. And you'll hear them called the Grand Old Party on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. They call them the GOP a lot. In the news, you'll hear that instead of the Republican Party, um, which is an interesting term. It's kind of have this positive nostalgia about the Republican Party, even though technically the Democrats are about 30 years older, so they're actually an older party. And the Republicans break off from the Democratic Republicans as well, and they really established themselves under Abraham Lincoln is where they really get their first strong presidential candidate. And the Republicans, again, under alignment of Lincoln's party, would be the Democrats of today. I don't think anybody would argue that historically. So Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and one of the reasons that the Civil War was fought because Abraham Lincoln said that he was against slavery. Um, he wasn't as anti-slavery as one would think, but he said that we could abolish slavery, and that was kind of the spark that caused the Sumner in South Carolina to be like, no, we're going to actually succeed from the Union. So the radical Republicans, if you remember in history, were the group of they would have been like your very progressive Democrats today, almost like your social, like they would have been like almost like your social Democrats, where they're really advocating for equal human rights across the board for African Americans. And Abraham Lincoln was not necessarily a true radical Republican. He was definitely more moderate than like a Thaddeus Stevens was the guy that got hit in the head with a cane and beat up for talking against slavery and being an abolitionist, so forth. And we have Sumner High School down the street in Stevens Middle School in honor of them in St. Louis City. Sumner High School. Sumner was one of the radical Republicans again that fought for equality, but the party realigned. And really, when that final realignment happened is in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's kind of when the Republicans really unified to be the party we know today. And a lot of the ideas have changed since then. We'll go into that. The Democrats had become the party we know as of today, or been more finalized under Roosevelt, but after his death and the Civil Rights Act. So let's get into the ideology being the right. So if you're to the right, you're somebody that's conservative. You tend to be less government intervention in the economy. Fiscal conservatives, there's a lot of questions today of the Republican Party's currently. We're not seeing necessarily a lot of fiscally conservative Republicans, at least at the national level. We have seen several examples of stimulus paid out to the American public in the form of $1,200 checks and $600 checks under President Trump, who is a Republican or was a Republican. And that would probably not align with a true fiscally conservative Republican. They would have issues with the government giving money to people in the bad economy. They would be okay with giving money to companies, corporations, and businesses during the pandemic. But however, they're not going to be a big fan of this giving money to taxpayers. It's all about personal responsibility. You are responsible for yourself. So giving people money enables them. They might argue something like that. We even have a lawsuit dealing with that in Missouri right now, where our Republican government in the state of Missouri accidentally overpaid people on unemployment benefits, and now they want the money back. They say, no, it's about personal responsibility. You give us the money back. Well, it's been several months now, and those people in need have spent the money. But on the Republican side, they feel like, no, you should still have to give the money back. And other people are like, well, it's too late. They spent the money, then they don't really have the money to pay back. So they're very much more laissez-faire, hands off of everything of the industry. So, for example, you see that with environment. So they don't not necessarily gonna go for green energy if gas companies are making the money right now and they're providing jobs. Leave it alone. Let it stand. The government gets involved, that interferes with things. Little government regulations of business and American economy. And they think the Democrats are way too much regulation. And again, when FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, became president, that was the beginning of the end for the Republicans. And the Republican we know today, though, are really started in the 60s. They finalized in the 1960s. People pay a small tax, so they want smaller taxes. So we have a progressive sales tax system where the wealthiest people in America pay around 33, 34% taxes, and people that don't make a lot of money, they might pay 10% tax or next to no tax, depending if you don't make any money at all, almost no money at all. Well, they don't believe in that. They believe that we should pay smaller taxes at the minimum, and a lot of Republicans like Mitt Romney had even pushed what's called a flat tax. Now, flat tax is where everybody, regardless of how much money you make, you pay like 15%. It's kind of been a magic number. So everybody in America would pay 15%. They say that's very fair. That's a fair tax if you're a Republican. Where the Democrats will counter on that and they'll say, no, that's actually a recessive tax, meaning it actually, the less money you make, the more taxes you pay. Because if I make $10,000 a year, and then I have to spend 15%, $1,500 to a man that makes $10,000 a year, is definitely has a bigger economic impact than to 15% of $100 million, which is $15 million, to a 100 millionaire. You know, if he has $100 million, that's not going to affect him as much. He'll lose $15 million is the argument. They also argue for what's called a trickle-down tax. So trickle-down taxes or Reaganomics is the idea when the economy gets bad, if you're going to do tax cuts, you should cut at the wealthiest. And we saw that in the last administration under President Trump and the Republicans. They were in office for 2 years. The one thing they clearly got accomplished was that they did huge corporation tax cuts. They cut corporate taxes by quite a bit. And they cut taxes of people that made a lot more money. And as you made less money, your taxes stayed about the same, or some people end up paying more money as a result of their tax code. So they've definitely restructured the tax code to benefit this idea of a Reaganomics, or the money will trickle down. The money's going to come from the wealthy companies and the business are spending the money, and then they're going to hire people, and their wealth is going to trickle down onto others. And we saw some of the consequences of this was that a lot of companies did what was called stock buybacks. They actually spent big chunks of this money to buy their own stock back, and they raised their stock prices, which benefited their shareholders, people that own their shares or their stocks. And that upset some people because they're like, well, then the taxpayers basically just gave money for companies to get wealthier. And that was one of the consequences of this system. But if you're a laissez-faire Republican, you'd be like, well, that's just how the market works. Taxes are for a larger military. They tend to support business growth above all. And they'd be okay with spending something like 30-40% of our budget is on the military. They're like, that's a good investment. You have to have a strong defense, and that money is well spent to protect America and to protect us from terrorism, and they tend to be much more pro-military. Okay. All right, so we're going to break down these terms a little bit better. So they believe in what's called supply-side economics. They give tax cuts to the wealthy capitalists to reinvest in their production and goods and services, therefore increasing supply. And that's that trickle-down or Reaganomics effect. So you will hear the test. I'll call it Reaganomics, so supply-side economics. And then people call it trickle-down theory, which is this idea it's going to trickle down to the poor or middle-class people or lower-class people are going to get jobs because these companies. So if you give Amazon a tax cut, which we have, they almost paid no taxes a couple of years ago. If you give them $15 million more in taxes, they're going to use that money and they're going to hire more people, or they're going to expand their hubs. They're going to build a new hub in St. Louis and hire people, and people are going to get jobs from this. And that factories too. Factories will build more factories and hire more people. And a counter argument by, well, yeah, but they could also mechanize the factories, meaning they can put a lot of machinery in there and not even have people if there's no restrictions on how they spend the money. So economic growth and prosperity is more important than the environment. When it comes to the environment, we have to focus on America's growth and making money. The bottom line is the bottom line, is making money. That's the bottom line. So companies are in the business of making money. So if they can make money, the environment might have to suffer, but maybe someday keeping the environment safe will make money. Like people will buy food that's healthier, or they won't waste their utilities as much, or maybe they're going to demand solar energy. But until that happens, it's laissez-faire. Let the economy do its own thing. It's not really the government's job to step in on this. Similar to Anti-Federalist Party, and remember, they would be much more like the Anti-Federalists. They believed in stronger state government and state popular sovereignty. So, state popular sovereignty is this idea that states rule themselves. And you could see it's like Texas. We just used the example of their energy, their power grid is independent from the rest of the United States, and that's actually really interesting because there's three major power grids: one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, and one in Texas. And Texas has its own power grid and wants to be independent. And we saw that there are maybe plus and minuses to that. One consequence was a snowstorm. They could not pull from energy from the West Coast or the East Coast power grids because they had to integrate. They're not working collaboratively with other grids. And a lot of people lost power and food, water, everything spoiled, and we had a lot of issues. But on the other side of it, Texas is like, well, yeah, but we're independent and we get to rule ourselves. And there are many very conservative Texans that have argued that maybe Texas should actually succeed. It's big enough to be its own country, and that maybe they need more autonomy as a state because Texas is Texas. So I don't know if you've been to Texas. They literally have like Texas-shaped potato chips, and everything's got Texas on it. You see their soda, the cans and stuff will have like Texas on it, even though it'll say like it's made. I saw like a Bud Light can and it had a big Texas emblem and it said made in St. Louis, Missouri. You would think it was made in Texas. It wasn't. So they're very proud of their state. Very similar to Mississippi, Alabama are very much more state popular sovereignty. They like, this is Mississippi. We run things the way we want. That tends to be much more in sync with the Republicans. They tend to think that way. And we've seen the consequences with the vaccinations. Some states are running the vaccinations very fastly, quickly. Other states are very slow. But Republicans are okay with the idea that the states are in charge of it. They can decide for what's good for their state, who gets vaccinated first, or who doesn't get, or who gets vaccinated last. That's the idea of popular sovereignty, state popular sovereignty. Remember, popular sovereignty is independence. Like power comes from the people. If you say popular sovereignty, state popular sovereignty is the idea that the power comes from the people of that state, and their state and their independence is more important than the federal government. Again, pushing back to the anti-federalists and going all the way back to this idea of when we talked about the Confederacy. Now, they believe in de-evolution. De-evolution, or the de-evolution revolution, is an effort to slow the growth of federal government by returning many functions to the states. So they want to take that federal government power that they have now and they want to push it back. So we've talked in the past about how the Supreme Court is more conservative now. Are they going to be much more de-evolution oriented? Are they going to start putting more of the federal powers back to the states? Like gun control has been one that the Republicans have done a great job. They've won that now guns have basically no restrictions. And states have, even Missouri, it's an inalienable right to own a gun, which has caused some issues. Maybe even felons can own guns now in Missouri. But that's what the state wants, and that's what the people in the state of Missouri want. Therefore, that's a state function. It's not the federal government's job to regulate weapons. That's very much in sync with what the Republicans believe. Now, Republican really starts changing what's called new conservatism. New conservatism began with the politics of Barry Goldwater and the economics of Milton Friedman in the 1960s. And it was this idea of true fiscal conservatism and that the government should shrink. The federal government we have too much big government, we need small government. So the federal government is too big, it does too many things for people. Like there's Medicare, there's Medicaid, there's Social Security. I mean, all this money is being spent and coming out of our paychecks. Why not put that money back into the taxpayers' pockets? Okay? Even public education. If you're a true conservative, most conservatives say we should at least pay for some kind of public education. Everybody gets educated. But if you're a libertarian, you would actually go further in that. Say, look, if somebody doesn't want to go to school, why is the government making them go to school? So let's cut back on that. We don't need to spend money on that. So again, and this would really benefit wealthy people, tend to like this idea a lot more than poor people or middle class people, because if I'm wealthy and I get to pay like $1 billion less taxes next year, I might spend some money to get a Republican elected. And also, I think that I'm brilliant with my money, therefore I could spend my money better than the government, and I think a lot of people think that. So they want to go back, and that's Reagan. President Reagan really made a movement under this new conservatism in the 80s to do that, to shrink government. And he did. He shrunk some government. He even had tax cuts for if you owned a racehorse, you get a tax cut in America. Um, he made some very interesting tax cuts. So obviously, a lot of people don't own racehorses, but you can get a tax cut for that under these programs. Now, New Conservatives is against Roosevelt's New Deal. It's the complete opposite of Roosevelt is trying to expand government and good government to help people, feed them, house them, all these programs. And you got the socialist Democrats that say that Roosevelt, they want to go further. They want universal health care. New conservatives, no, we need to get rid of all that stuff. We need to cut down on Medicaid, Medicare, all that stuff, Social Security. And one big idea that came out of new conservatives under Social Security is we should privatize. Everything should be private. Companies should own things, not government at all. So even your Social Security should go to the stock market. Why can't we just put our money in the stock market? Why do we have to put Social Security and just receive a flat check when we get older? So he considered them embodying government overreach. The government has too much overreach. They regulate too much. This is causing deficits. It makes our money inflate. It causes unemployment. This is all terrible things the government is doing. So it's going to be a lot. It's going to be pretty easy to go through this slide. So we talk about what they're opposed to. They're generally opposed to Medicare. They don't like these programs that were created. They don't care for Medicaid, and paying for this. Again, that's government health care for people that are elderly. If the government would get out of it, they would argue you're going to have better private services, and insurance companies will charge a fair rate. Let the private companies deal with this. Medicare, is that taking care of people in need and so forth? Is that really the federal government's responsibility? And many are going to argue no. It's very expensive. It costs the taxpayers. Why do they have to do that? Social Security, they want to privatize it. There's a lot of movement to try to maybe put it in the stock market, or you could spend that money on other things. You don't have to sit there and take care of somebody at 65. They want to every time they get in government, they cut down on public assistance like EBT. Public housing shrinks under Republican rule. They don't like Section 8 or public housing or assistance. They say that enables people. It's about personal responsibility, and you got to get out there and get a job. If somebody's poor, it's mostly their responsibility to get out of poverty. You're just going to have to work harder. You're not doing it. And then finally, universal health care is an absolute nightmare. Like the idea that we'd actually have socialized medicine, there's nothing worse than the word socialism if you're a Republican. And it was very effective. Even when Trump ran and lost against Joe Biden, socialism was a word that got a lot of Republicans very emotional and upset. They don't like that idea. And especially Cuban Americans vote Republican because they're from Cuba. They would have been the people that don't support communism or Fidel Castro or Raul Castro in Cuba, and they've moved to America. Their families came to America because they were capitalists. They made money off Cuba, and they came to America to get away from that. So they really don't care for socialism. They tend to vote Republican. Okay. Now, let's talk about socially conservative. Socially conservative people tend to be much law and order. So it's about you got to follow the laws and order. You got to respect the police. Don't question things. Do what you're supposed to do. That's patriotism. To follow the rules and do what you're supposed to do. You also have freedom, though. Like you shouldn't be forced by the government to wear a mask in a pandemic. That's been a big debate. Some Republicans have changed their mind on that debate. Said no, we're going to have to put the rights of the society over the individual. That's a big debate. They tend to think of themselves as much more individualistic as Democrats. Democrats have all these social programs to help the people, for the people, the masses, most people, where the Republicans are like, it's not their responsibility. You should be responsible for yourself, and you should be responsible for your health care and your kids' education. And if you're poor, you need to get out there and work. They believe abortion should be illegal. They're pro-life. If you're socially conservative, and again, not all social conservatives are Republicans, and there are social conservative Democrats where social conservatism is not as important as the way the Democrats deal with the social programs. Prayer in schools is acceptable. They don't see it as an issue. It's very common if you were to go to the South or a conservative area. I guarantee we could hear principals leading the kids in prayer at the beginning of the day in school. And they wouldn't see that as against the rights of the minorities, like people that aren't Christian, that don't want to do the prayer or don't want to hear the prayer or they're not religious at all. It's just that's what the majority of Americans are. They're Christian, and that those are the ideas and beliefs of our country, they would argue. Capitalist punishment should be legal. They're for the death penalty. If somebody commits a crime, that if it's a horrible crime and they hurt or kill people, they should be able to receive the death penalty. Republican states tend to have much more death penalty than Democratic states, and the federal government still has the death penalty. We are the one country in the Western world that violates the United Nations because it's against the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights to take another person's life, because you have a right to life, even if you commit a crime. But they don't have an issue with this. They said no. If somebody commits a crime, they can still get capital punishment. They can be sentenced to death. Now, this is a very important point. If somebody's socially conservative, they believe private sector will help people, not the government. So it's not that they're saying that they don't believe people should help each other. That's not what they're saying. They're going to say, I don't think it's the government's responsibility to help anybody. So the private sector will help people, not the government. So e.g., churches, non-for-profit organizations like the Red Cross, Salvation Army. And we do. We have many non-for-profit organizations that are not led by the government. You even think about the YMCA, Young Men's Christian Organization. There's a Christian group that helps people with everything from providing them with gyms and sports. Salvation Army is, again, for food. Churches do fundraisers. You've got St. Vincent de Paul in St. Louis right down the street that gets reduced almost free furniture and clothes for people in need. The counter argument might be, well, that's only about 10%. So especially of food, 10% of the food in America that goes to people in need is from private sector. 90% of EBT, of the food is EBT, or government subsidized, or food given away to people in need, are supported. So that's another question. And some other questions would be, well, when things are really, really bad, will people give more money in a recession or a depression? Behavior-wise, the answer tends to be no. Most people don't start giving more money when they're in a recession or a depression like right now. They actually do the opposite. They start to hoard their money or put their money in savings because they're afraid something's going to happen. And that's a big issue with trickle-down theory as well, because when we give money back to wealthy people, we know historically what they do is they put their money in savings, or they put their money in stock markets and investments, and they make money off their money. Well, that's a problem because that causes inflation. So if they're making more money by putting their money in savings or creating more money, just making money off the money, what happens is everybody else's money goes down in value. So if you're somebody that's not making money off your money, your dollar just got worth less. So now it's $2 to get a loaf of bread instead of $1. And that inflation increases as a result of that. So the question is that going to be offset in your pay? Because you have to get paid more money or make more money to offset the inflation. So remember, every year you need to make 2% more to break even in America. If you make no raise at all, you're actually taking a 2% pay cut this year. If you get 3%, you're actually getting a 1% raise the following year. And then law and order. They tend to be pro-military, pro-police. We said we're one of the only unions that really tend to be much more Republican is the police unions. Not all. There's many police unions that are Democrat. And unions overall are much more Democrat because the Republicans tend to be very much against unions. But if there's one union that they won't mess with, it tends to be the police unions. The police are usually on their side more so than the Democrats. Fire unions, a different story though. They tend to be more Democrat. So you have to understand that they think that police should have more power and more ability to, protect themselves and so forth. We've seen that debate come forward as well. So let's look at this. Opinions and support for congressional gun control. So this is really interesting. So Republicans are very, very pro Second Amendment. The National Rifle Association, the NRA, is the largest supporter of the Republican Party. Just like the the biggest supporter of the Democrats is the unions. The National Rifle Association is definitely the biggest supporter, and it is the biggest interest group in America, with over 3 million members in America. They give lots of money to the Republican Party, and they need them. So let's look at this. This is interesting. So you're looking at gun control measures, and you see that you would think maybe it breaks down more on men and women, right? Like, okay, it starts off like, wow, 56% of men support gun control measures, and 33% oppose it. And then you go to women, it's higher, 58 to 33. But wait a second, that's in the Northeast. That's in a more liberal Democrat area. What about the Midwest? Midwest is kind of in the middle. We got conservatives, we got some progressives, and we're kind of skeptical of government. But not everybody. We have some people. I believe we got some good government. Midwest is almost an even break, but actually we tend to be less in favor than the Northeast on gun control. We tend to be more pro-gun for men, and women are about the same. And this is interesting. You go to the South, look at that. Women and men are only 30% of them. That's only 3 out of 10 are in support of gun control or gun protection measures. You go to the West, and it's the complete opposite. It's almost 65. You're just creeping up the other way. So this is an interesting question. Preceding the table most clearly shows a large difference in opinions based on, well, believe it or not, I think if I would have asked you, men and women, I think a lot of people would have said, well, women are more for gun control than men. Men like guns. Actually, regionism. What region of the United States probably determines if you're more pro-gun or you're more for restrictions on guns? Isn't that interesting? If you live in the Midwest, you tend to be definitely more in favor than the South, but definitely less in favor than the Northeast or the West, more liberal areas. So that's very interesting. Okay, so their biggest supporters are the elite, the very, very wealthy. I'm talking about million and billionaires here. Top 400 people own something like 60% of the country, okay? They own most of the wealth. So these guys are definitely Republicans. They do not, for the most part, want to pay taxes. There is exceptions to this. You have some exceptions. Very wealthy people. Warren Buffett, for example, in Nebraska. He's kind of an interesting guy. He still lives in the house he was born and raised in. It's just a 3-bedroom house in Omaha, Nebraska. And he's probably the 3rd or 4th wealthiest man in the country. He's a multi-billionaire. And he actually complained that his secretary was paying more taxes than him proportionally because she makes so much less money and he's a billionaire. He's like, I pay less taxes though, based on my percentage. They made a big stink about this. Now there are Democratic elite, but not most. Most very, very wealthy elite people think that they know what to do best with their own money. Wealthy people are very much Republican. Upper class tend to be much more Republican. If you go to an upper class area, like if you start moving in St. Louis, you even go to like the Chesterfield or very wealthy areas like Frontenac and Town and Country, it tends to be much more Republican, as opposed to like if you do more middle class areas like Maplewood and Brentwood and University City tend to be much more Democrat. Big businesses, corporations, they're very Republican. Some businesses have even been criticized for giving money directly to the Republican Party, like Best Buy. Had some people were protesting Best Buy and kind of not buying their stuff for years. I mean, Jeff Bezos has literally had parties where the head of the Federal Reserve under Donald Trump was at the party. Well, that's some Democrats argue that was a contradiction, or that was also a conflict of interest to have the head of the Federal Reserve and basically the guy in charge of the economy partying with Jeff Bezos, the wealthiest man in the world at the time. They're about a majority men. Close to 70% of Republicans are men. It's actually becoming more male dominant. So that number is probably going up and less women in the party. Majority white, again, it is very white actually. I believe it's more than high 80% of the party is white. So they tend to be white males and white females. Fundamentalist Christians, a very important concept. Fundamentalist Christians, we talked about this last year. We did the Stokes trial, the John Scopes versus Tennessee. A fundamentalist Christian is somebody that believes the Bible, what they're reading in the Bible, is literal. So they would believe something like if it says the earth was created in 6 days and God rested on the seventh, they believe that the earth was created in 6 days. On the seventh day, God didn't do anything. And that means the world is only 5,000 years old. It's only as old as the Bible. So uh, that caused some with modernists were Christians that believe that the Bible is symbolic and can interpret like 6 days could be 6 billion years, and science and religion can work together. Our Christianity can go together. We also have fundamentalist Muslims. They do not tend to be Republican, but they're more likely to be. A fundamentalist Muslim and fundamentalist other religions tend to be much more Republican too. Cuban Americans tend to be very Republican. Again, we said that that's because they're from the rule of Fidel Castro, and they're very anti-socialist, very anti-communist. Their parents and they immigrated to America were probably pro-capitalist American. They worked with American businesses that came to our country and like our capitalism, so they're against Fidel. So they don't want to ever go back to anything like that. So they tend to